we have a global issue on our hands. The issues of South Africa aren't just the issues of South Africa.
Yeah.
And the issues in Canada aren't just the issues of Canada, because through our technology, we export our ideologies and our problems, and they come from the United States, they come from Canada, they come from all over. There's a global conversation that needs to happen here.
Sometimes it's very lazy, how we appropriate this global conversation. I often hear in our conversations Black people in South Africa referring to themselves as minorities. You're just listening to an American guy because it makes sense there, but yeah, it's really not the case.
Love God, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the AC Podcast. My name is Troy, and I am here today with Andy, and we have a special guest joining us all the way from South Africa, Johan Erasmus. Johan, welcome to the AC Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to virtually be here.
And congratulations for having the coolest name of anybody that we've had on the podcast.
Yes.
Well done.
Yes, it's true.
Well,
which apparently is a common name in South Africa.
Yeah, please don't say that to anybody in South Africa. I knew that I'm going to be cool somewhere. I'm just in the wrong country, man.
Yeah. That's right. Well, listeners, I want to just give you a quick backdrop as to who Johan is, at least in his professional world. And so Johan has a degree in philosophy and theology and is currently doing his PhD at the Northwest University in South Africa on the subject of race and reconciliation. He pastors a small multicultural church in Pretoria called Dialogue Community and is also involved with the Better Enders movement, focusing on social development and reconciliation. He is married to Lorraine, a film lecturer, and they have two boys, Lou and Eben.
Ewan, I'm guessing if you're married to a film lecturer, you're watching a lot of movies. Your wife is dragging you to movies, man. Is this true?
Well, the movies that she wants me to drag me to is not necessarily very exciting. It's very Art Nouveau type stuff. So it's very esoteric. So I am running out of excuses, to be honest.
I imagine a lot of those films are pretty niche, and most people have never heard of them.
Big time.
Big time.
I can imagine a number of conversations between you and your wife where you're just staring off into space as she's telling you about the nuances of these movies.
Wow.
Probably.
I'm just not as subtle as I should be. So I would just go and say, so just let me just get this plot straight. And with all the money in the world, is this the best set that they can design? So it's very, very arty, and it's very deliberately arty. She's tried to educate me, taking me to art galleries around the world, and yeah, but I'm afraid it's a losing cause.
Now, I got to say, I was first introduced to your work in this great book called Coming to Faith through Dawkins. You contribute a chapter in here called An Afrikaner's Faith Pilgrimage, which was really, really quite excellent. I highly, highly recommend it. Not only is the book great, but of course your chapter is wonderful. And it was interesting to note that at one time you would have claimed to be an atheist before coming to faith. Maybe just give us a quick snapshot of your faith journey.
Yeah. So I would be careful to not say that, but I would just use the disclaimer that I was so many things at so many times, and I think the other word for that is confused, or maybe just being a university student. But the fact of the matter is that I was confronting all of these ideas in real time, and because I came from a very conservative environment setup, there is pressure to believe. There is pressure to be a Christian. Sometimes it's very superficial. You can just sort of say the right things and tick the boxes. It doesn't have to be necessarily very deep. But from a cultural perspective, you have to sort of tick the boxes. I assume it's sort of similar to what you have in the American South, but not that I've ever been there. And so it was a very lonely place to sort of wrestle with these questions. And eventually, when I went to varsity, I became a little bit more open about some of my questions and my skepticism. But I can't necessarily say that I was a full-blown atheist, because it really depends on which day you ask me, because certain days it really felt like there's nothing, and I was convinced by what I was reading at that stage. Other times I really wanted to believe. Other times I really didn't want to believe. I stated in my chapter that when there was the options of acting on certain sexual desires, and these Christians have this very conservative sex ethic, then it became very nice to think that I'm the master, I'm the captain of my soul, I'm the master of my body, I can do whatever I want. But it wasn't just in that sort of sphere that I was wrestling. It was intellectual, it was emotional, it was physical. And then eventually, I mean, you guys are an apologetics organization. I never heard of the word, but then I met a friend of mine who went to study apologetics in America, sort of a combination of philosophy and apologetics. And at that stage, I was reading the New Atheists, and I thought, well, they seem to make sense. They are ridiculing Christianity, and I'm sort of agreeing with them. And then this girl, she famously in my mind, when I said, "Have you read Dawkins? Have you read Harris?" Because usually nobody responds to that. And she says, "Oh, Johan, if you're going to be an atheist, have some self-respect. Get yourself some better atheists." And I mean, I don't want to insult. I know that Dawkins and Harris are big fans of your podcast, so I don't want to necessarily insult them.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But I and then she went on and gave me like good atheists that I should read. Read these guys. If you become an atheist because you read a Graham Oppy or who did she call Michael Roos and some of these other guys, then that's fine. But don't give it away that easily. It was a very bizarre encounter, but that sort of set me on this journey, which was partly intellectual, that introduced me to the Christian intellectual tradition. And it was so rich, and somehow I've missed it all my life. And I can safely say it really did change my life.
Wow.
Oh, that's amazing. One of the things that you talk about in the book that we want to talk about today, that really, caught my attention, is you talk about race or grace in your chapter, and you said this about critical theory. You said critical theory might have sounded like a good idea to the likes of Foucault and other postmodern thinkers, but it's not bringing white and black South Africans together. As a matter of fact, it is pushing us so far apart that it would have made the apartheid government smile. But when we have these difficult conversations in church, we are reminded of our own selfishness and need for change. And I thought, man, what an important conversation, and particularly juxtaposing these two between conversation of critical theory in society in large, but the conversation of race in the church and what that looks like. Now, we should say that Troy and I were in South Africa just recently.
Oh wow!
We were there in May, because it's always been a dream of mine to go cage diving with great white sharks.
There we go.
But the great whites never showed up, Yuan. I'm still a little. Apparently, you've got some hungry orcas out there that have been eating all your great whites.
But you know what? It's because of the critical race theory, because this attack on whiteness has extended to the seas.
Oh man. The world is fallen.
You would notice that the orcas are significantly more black than the great whites, so it sort of really fits, doesn't it? It's a sign of the times.
It's a sign of the times. All right. Well, it's going to be great having you on the podcast.
We're done. We're done. PETA is somewhere just shaking.
Oh no, they're amening it.
Yeah.
No, but it was really quite stunning to be there. The amount of beautiful scenery was incredible. I got to tell you, the baboons are terrifying, but the scenery was just breathtaking. But one thing I did notice when I was there is I was not fully aware of the challenges of South Africa, and I don't really understand the history of South Africa.
Mm.
But I did know and had heard, that South Africa is one of the, crime-wise, is one of the um, most has some of the highest crime of anywhere in the world.
Mm.
That's kind of the statistic that comes out, not the beauty of South Africa or the safari parks and the natural beauty, but you often hear about crime.
Yeah.
But it was interesting being there and just seeing the tension. I could, as a foreigner, I could feel the tension that's going on. South Africa, that was probably heightened because I was there right before and during the election that just recently happened. What was that, on May 29th, I think it was? And I think maybe a question just to get into before we get too far is just to ask, can you tell us a little bit more about that tension? Can you just give us a snapshot on the history? Like, what, for those listeners who are probably wondering, what is apartheid? What is some of that? I know it's a long history, but could you just give our listeners just a brief understanding of what is going on in South Africa?
I mean, it's an unfair question, but let's try and do it. So I think the story of South Africa is one where you had these Dutch settlers. These are my descendants way back. We're talking about the 1600s, who settled here, and then the fight turned not necessarily so much between the Dutch that would later become the Afrikaner and the black people of South Africa, but between the Afrikaner and the English. And the Afrikaner was colonized after they had these little, where I stay, in what used to be called the Transvaal, Pretoria, Joburg, that area, used to be sort of an independent Afrikaner republic. And I'm now sort of at this point excluding the history of the white people that were the black people that were displaced because of this. But then gold and diamonds and everything were discovered here in Johannesburg in the north, and then the English came in again. And eventually there was this horrible war, which we sometimes call the South African War, sometimes the Anglo-Boer War. And after that, soon there was a bit of a union between the English and the Afrikaner, but then there was an Afrikaner independence. And this was, to a certain extent, the birth of apartheid. And the reason why I'm doing that little detour is just to say that apartheid was born, and it was ferocious, partly because the Afrikaner was operating from a place of fear. They never wanted to be colonized again. And the parallels, you can see it up and down the centuries, whether it's Israel, who were genuinely victimized and decide that this will never happen again. Masada will never fall again. Auschwitz will never happen again. I remember seeing in Israel this bumper sticker that read, rather a strong Israel that's hated by the world than an Auschwitz Israel that's loved by the world. And I think that same sentiment was in the Afrikaner. And then there were different fears. The fears were the communist danger, the red danger, and then was the black danger, this black majority. How are we going to solve that problem? And eventually what they tried to do is they tried to sort of put all the black people in, they called it countries, but sort of these Bantustans. They were like reserves, effectively. And it was impossible for them to even operate as a country. And there was no will from the black people to operate this small little patch of land with all the people. It's just not sustainable. And eventually the white people, although they had the majority of South Africa and they gave these reserves for the black people, the different tribes, they wanted these guys to come and work in South Africa. They wanted these guys to work in the mines, work in the factories, etc. So you wanted cheap labor. But now there's this conflict of interest because now this person is an alien. He doesn't belong in South Africa. He doesn't have an identity. So that is why people draw comparisons between us and Israel, because these West Bank Palestinians are coming into work and sort of an alien in that space. And long story short, there were just horrible laws that were implemented to try and facilitate this thing, such as it was illegal for black and white people to marry each other. It was illegal for black and white people to be in the same areas, to stand in the same queues. And you have all those photos online. Bizarrely see them standing in the different queues. Now, that's not so abnormal. I think you've got that in America with Jim Crow laws as well. But But in South Africa, it was really brutal. It was really long. And the thing is, we only got our liberation in 1994. That was just the other day. And this is happening in real time, so to speak. We're living
Mhm.
through this. And, we've, uh, and we've tried to figure it out. And it's a very exciting place to live in, but it's also a very challenging place to live in because the history that people are one day going to write about is pretty much where we are at, trying to make sense of this. Now, the miracle of 1994, and I'm sorry that I'm going on as long, was the fact that
Okay.
was the fact that there was no civil war. You had white people who had a very big army, Africa's largest army by a country mile, who gave up that army, who laid down their weapons. I'm not trying to romanticize that. They were thoroughly the bad guys as well. But they handed it over, and you had a black leadership under the leadership of Mandela, who decided that they're not going to take revenge after being thrown in jail for 27 years. And I mean, one can share just horrible stories. The next time you come to South Africa, I can take you to places like Soweto where you can encounter these stories firsthand. And they chose reconciliation. And to me, this is one of the biggest miracles. The world has celebrated it as a miracle for a long time. And in the last decade or so, maybe a little bit more, that miracle, this idea of us being a rainbow nation, we, I mean, there's not a lot of places where you've got power being transferred without blood being shed. That is that is
Yeah.
bizarre.
Yeah.
That is bizarre. The fears that were in South Africa, people were really paranoid and worried. They were buying canned food and they were ready to go live in a cave for years. And it was a very very bizarre time, and we got through it because of some good leadership. But what we're seeing now is that miracle of South Africa, the role that the church has played, and many other players are currently being thrown under the bus because of, I think, the influence of critical race theory, um, where where this has come to South Africa, and it's not just that; it's also because there are real fault lines, and we thought that if apartheid stops, everything is going to be okay, and that was naive. So, so I'm not trying
Mhm.
to dismiss all of it, but
Sure.
but I do think um, that what we see now, which is very fascinating, is that the kids of the real victims of apartheid, the people who struggled, who were part of the apartheid struggle, they feel the emotions of their fathers more than the fathers and the mothers. They feel the pain
Mm.
of their parents more than their parents. The parents were willing to forgive, the kids, not so much. And this is
Mm.
a sociological phenomenon that's not unique to South Africa. You you can see that, for example, among the Jews, if I'm not mistaken, the the generation of the Holocaust survivors actually resented their parents for not, resisting the Nazis and not standing up. So that very strong wave of Zionism started the
Mm.
generation after the Holocaust. It wasn't necessarily the Holocaust survivors. Like I said, you've got different examples of that. So, but here's the other problem, just to make things more complicated. So, in South Africa, it is true that white people, by and large, I mean, when you talk about race, you're going to talk in generalized terms. People are going to get offended, but otherwise, we're not going to say anything. White people are generally richer. Black people are generally poorer. The statistics are stark. You saw some of that when you were here, Andy. Just you see these amazing
It was very
mansions.
clear.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
you see these amazing mansions, and then you see these shacks, and it's a very stark contrast. Now, it's
Yep.
true that a lot of those mansions are now slowly and systematically being occupied by a ever-growing black middle class, which is exciting. We are excited about that. But you've got this problem. But now you've got another problem. That is, we've got official policies in government like black economic empowerment, which makes sense because how are you going to try and address this uh, systemic thing, economic thing that's happened for centuries, effectively? You have to fast track it. So now we've got that. But the only problem is that if you think of affirmative action, it was always designed to help the minority, but now you've got the majority who's in charge politically helping themselves, so to speak, against this rich, and one can even say questionably rich white minority. Are you with me? So that's complicated now. So
Yeah.
here's the other problem. So now you've got lots of white kids who want to study medicine who can't get into university because of quotas, and you've got the same in rugby, etc. So you've got a lot of white people in South Africa, because we're a minority and because there are these laws, who are genuinely convinced that they are the victims. And if you listen to some of their stories, it's quite compelling. But now you've got the other problem, that if you listen to so many black people, given the history of apartheid and stuff that's happening now, they are thoroughly convinced that they are the victim. So it's a bit of a stalemate. And I'm not even talking about the Indians and the coloreds who are never part of the debate. They're not white enough, they're not black enough. So welcome to South Africa.
Now, to put some stats to this, if I understand correctly, white people in South Africa make up about 7% of the population. Would that be about right?
Yeah, I mean, between 7 and 10.
Okay, so that's the kind of minority that we're talking about. And if people are wondering, you might find this interesting. One of our board members is from South Africa, but he is him and his wife are of Indian descent, but they are South African. If I understand correctly, the reason for that, if there's anybody who's curious about this, is during the Dutch colonization, they brought over slaves from India. Is that right?
To work in the sugarcane fields of Natal, and they brought these Indians. That's how Mahatma Gandhi actually started his career in South Africa. He was part of that crowd who came to South Africa. I'm not sure if he worked in the sugar fields or if he was just trying to represent the people who worked in the sugar fields. But that's where he started his activism, was here in South Africa during that time. So yeah, it's very bizarre. If you go to Durban, you would think that we've got 50% of the population is Indian, but it's a small population. It's like 3 or 4%, but they are very much located on our east coast, the Natal area. But that is where they were dropped by, like you say, the English. I think that by then it was more English, to be honest, because they came from India, which was part of the Indian colony. You had people who came from Malaysia, and they were brought by the Dutch to the Western Cape. Today we call them Cape Malay.
Before we even take a step further for our listeners, like this is why blanketed arguments are just so dangerous, and just like they're very unnecessary, because I mean, you look at the complexity of just you trying to explain the history of apartheid in South Africa to where it is now. There was something that I really resonated with when you're talking about how the young people are now the ones that almost want to take up the arms that they felt like their parents didn't get to, right? As if an injustice, I mean, there was injustice for sure, but it was as if they don't believe that the restoration was real, and as if it was forced on them. And if they had their opportunity, they would have done something else. I remember Andy and I were talking with a young lady briefly when we were in Malawi, and she was from South Africa. Her mother was there. She was in Malawi now working. And I remember Andy and I walking away from that conversation so burdened, because she was very, very much like what you were saying. She was very emboldened and passionate about, like, oh, this is the way it should have been. Things are supposed to be going like this. And we're currently in Malawi talking about starvation. We're talking about people that are preparing for the hungry season, or preparing to starve and die. And she wants to ask us about all of the racism going on in the United States and how that correlates. And we're just like, what?
It was baffling, but I got to say, one of the things that Troy and I walked away going, man, we have a global issue on our hands. The issues of South Africa aren't just the issues of South Africa. And the issues in Canada aren't just the issues of Canada, because through our technology, we export our ideologies and our problems, and they come from the United States. They come from Canada. They come from all over. And it was interesting, Troy, like in our conversation with her, it was very clear that her opinions were being informed, and she was quite open about this.
Very
from social
straightforward
media.
about it.
That her opinions were being formed by social media. And and so the reason we're bringing that up is, Troy and I walked away from that going, oh man, there's a global conversation that needs to happen here, because there's a lot of people don't realize what's going on.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah, she was asking us about, what was it like going to the protest? I would have loved to have gone to one of those and seen all that stuff. I was like, absolutely not. But but Yuan, you were going to say something in regards to that.
Yeah, sometimes it's very lazy how we appropriate this global conversation. So, for example, I often hear in our conversations Black people in South Africa referring to themselves as minorities. I'm thinking, man, you're just lazy. You're just listening to an American guy because it makes sense there. But yeah, it's really not the case. And actually, when we had our lockdown with the COVID, some people were trying their best to sort of pin our police for police brutality. But I mean, our police are useless. We wish they were a little bit more brutal. But again, just trying to live out this thing that they are seeing, being mediated through North America and to a certain extent Europe, trying to live it out here in South Africa. So very much a global conversation. And I think what's also I find sometimes annoying is that, especially my white friends, people like Ben Shapiro, people like Jordan Peterson, even Fox News, Tucker Carlson, those guys, they are household names here. Like they really do pop up on the feeds, and they've really informed our conversation. And here's the very sad thing is that I think at least sad. I was a few years ago. We were part of this group, and we went away for like a week or so, and they had young Black and white leaders, and then they brought in these people who were part of the negotiation team in the early 90s that ensured that South Africa goes through a peaceful transition. They had people like Ahmed Kathrada. That guy spent I think 27 years exactly with Nelson Mandela in jail. These guys are people with character who did a lot. Rolf Meyer, who was from the Afrikaner side, the one who dragged people to the negotiating table, and they came to share with us. And then as they were sharing from their experiences, the young group just interrupted them and just said, "Listen, we're done listening to you. We don't want to listen to you. So you can listen to us." And then here's Ahmed Kathrada sharing with us, from his experience as a struggle hero. I think there's no way to put it. I mean, he's a Muslim guy, but there's no doubt questioning what this guy did. And you've got young people quoting Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi to him, and that is very strange, and that just shows how this is a global phenomenon. To a certain extent, this global phenomenon has even been thrown in the faces of the people who suffered severely under apartheid and who were responsible for a small, maybe a big miracle. And to me, that is part of the dilemma, is to sort of get these two worlds together. Because what's sad at the moment is guys like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela are thrown under the bus. I know in the US and in Europe, there are statues, and I mean there are plenty of statues here as well, but they are thrown under the bus by especially your young intellectual radical, calling them sellouts. Very suspicious. There's this hermeneutic of suspicion, very suspicious when they hear words like reconciliation, like forgiveness. And because Desmond Tutu and Mandela specialized on those words, these guys are now being replaced with more radical people like Frans Fanon from Algeria, and like I said, these Americans, Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, etc.
I just have a question in regards to that. Why would you say that happens? Like, how does that divide happen? Is it just, it's like young people want a new hero, or they want someone new to follow? Or because you would think that the stories from their parents, right? I mean, we get a lot of refugees here in Canada, and I have a lot of friends who they talk about, man, if my parents didn't come here, like they're running from a war-torn country, they hadn't come here to try and give us a better life, I wouldn't be here. And there's a lot of gratitude there, regardless of the civil wars that they were running from. But why would you say, maybe specifically in South Africa, there is a divide that has been created, and as you're kind of saying, is continuing to get bigger.
I think it's a nostalgia for a war they never had, and so
Mm,
sometimes in these conversations you'll hear somebody say, "You guys haven't bled yet." That's our problem with white people.
mm,
You haven't bled yet. So there's this sense
mm.
of the war, and don't just think that it's the black people who wanted the war. It was the white people who also wanted that war. I mean, segments within the right, who were denied their war, who were very upset to this day that the government laid down arms. The apartheid government, gave over the military, gave over atomic bombs. Effectively, we had atomic bombs. The first nation in the world, the only nation in the world to willingly get rid of their atomic weaponry. So
Yeah.
so it's I think it's also maybe got to do with the fact that there is not a clear enemy. There's not a clear
Right.
enemy, and people want a cause. And in South Africa, the clear enemy for so long was apartheid. It was this liberation. You had this liberationist
Mm,
movement, but now the ANC, who used to be sort of the face of the liberation movement, they need to govern. They need to figure out service delivery, etc., stuff like that. And I think then when something like critical theory comes and they reveal some of these hidden mechanisms behind everything, this invisible hand, then that is a cause to get behind
yeah.
again. And I think that is true wherever in the United States, Canada, and Europe as well. There's this big vacuum. People want a cause. They want to fight for something,
For
and
sure.
to certain extent, these various justice movements gave that to.
Mm,
It's ironic in many ways that when you have so much division, that there can be this unification over something that is so destructive. So if you have, we're not united, but we don't like that person, so we're united against that.
yeah.
Because one thing that was interesting from my conversations in Africa is I would ask people in, say, Malawi or Rwanda or elsewhere, hey, what's going on in South Africa? And it was interesting their response, because they would say, oh, they're like, okay, Africa is one thing, but South Africa, it
Yeah.
has distinct and unique issues. They really kind of separated South Africa from the rest of Africa. And one of the things that they said that I thought was interesting, and just goes to show the complexity of the issue, is they said, Andy, there's been fighting there for a long time. That
Mm,
you've got a lot in South Africa, although it's one country, it's many tribes. And these tribes have been divided for a very long time. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, they must be careful what they say because uh, South Africa is sort of the also apart from Canada because your laws are much stricter than ours. Um, but we've got so many Rwandans and Malawians and Zimbabweans who come to South Africa to to work here because
Yeah.
as far as Africa goes, there's a thriving economy going on. But it is
Yeah.
it
mm,
is a different animal, 100%, because and that's why I think it's such a fascinating place to live because you really have this Western world, some of the biggest luxury, the biggest stadiums, fancy stuff. You've got some of the most impressive highways. I've traveled a lot to appreciate some very impressive infrastructure, and then just very rural the next moment, and then you just have squatter camps, and it's just abject poverty. Um,
yeah.
so because it's such a strange setup, you've got these histories, you've got these tribes. It is a um, very difficult place, I think, to make sense of, which is which makes it also interesting, and that is why I am I'm a big fan of the word reconciliation, even though many people are throwing that under the
Yeah.
bus these days.
Yeah.
But I get very excited, and with our NGO Betereindes, we've got lots of activities that we still do, um, and it often gets into the media because we would take, for example, our black friends from the townships to go and watch a rugby game, which is a predominantly white sport, or at least used to be. It's beginning to change now. So then we've got like 100 people from the township watching the rugby game, and then we'll take our white friends, these Afrikaners, to go to a soccer game. You're the only white faces in that stadium, and we move each other into these spaces, and it's such an anomaly. It's so strange. People can't make sense of it. But I think that's part of our strategy, because I think because South Africa's issues are so complex, and because you've got one group that says first liberation, first justice, then reconciliation. The problem with that is justice is a very tricky thing to define. We all overestimate what is due me and what is due you. Justice is tricky sometimes to define. It's very difficult. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon our pursuit of justice. I am just saying that if you are going to say only reconciliation after justice, then there's never going to be reconciliation, because in some people's mind, justice will never be achieved. So these things have to run side by side. And the way in which we think these things need to happen is through relationship. So in South Africa, there's this one thing that's very controversial, and that is a large portion of the agricultural land still belongs to white people. And many black people, and many of the sort of left-wing groups would say, we want the land, we need this land, we need expropriation without compensation, we must just kick them off the land. And
Just to highlight that point, during the election that just recently happened, there was a group running that was part of their campaign, right?
Oh yeah. No. I mean, it's not a big deal, and they would even romanticize things that happened in Zimbabwe, for example, where they forcibly removed people from the farmlands there, and and they would say Mugabe is a hero of sorts. Now, these things are complex, and they're not stupid people who are saying this. They are very educated people. They work at our universities. They read all these CRT guys and more. But the point is that I do think there is an unjust distribution of wealth. I can see, it was plain for anybody to see. You guys were in South Africa for 5 minutes, you could see it. But now the question is, must you take my house? I don't have a farm. I've got this house. From what you guys can see, it's not overly spectacular. But I've got this, or half of it belongs to the bank. You can take that if you want. I'm now speaking to these politicians, these populists who wants to claim the land. But I think you are aiming too low if you want to take my house. You can get much more out of me than that. And then they say, okay, what do you want? I said, you actually want my contact. And you get my contacts through my friendship. So the biggest gift that I can give you is, I know this person over there. What kind of job is your daughter looking for? Okay, well, maybe you can talk to that person. That is our biggest gift that we can have. That's our biggest capital. That's social capital. And I think the critical race theorists, they speak a lot about that. And I think they're right. That there is something that I have that you can't measure in cars. And, it's not a monetary value, but it is a massive value. But if you are after those things, it needs to come through relationship. It needs to come through friendship. Now, unfortunately, that is not a very popular word, friendship, reconciliation, etc. But I think that is the key to take the land.
Let's just highlight this for a moment, because this is an important conversation piece that we've arrived at. For those that are still listening to this going, okay, what is critical theory? Just quickly put, critical theory argues that you can solve social problems through social structures. Is ultimately, I think, a simple way of putting it. Would you agree with that simple definition?
I'm so sorry. Because we spoke before, I sort of assumed that we spoke about critical race theory. So I think critical theory as a whole tries to say that there are certain forces at play behind things. And even though things like liberalism, things like democracy, things like reconciliation, even though it seems like a good idea, be careful, there's capital behind it. There are maybe white people behind it. Maybe it's patriarchy behind it. Like this toxic masculinity. So there is this suspicion, and it sees through things. Now remember, Christians also have a critical theory. We see idolatry most of the time through things. You see, that's that guy spending so much money in the mall. Just be careful, that's idolatry. So we also see things. We also have a lens. Now, the type of lens that you have if you're a critical race theorist is that you see reality as primarily structured through white supremacy and to preserve the interests of the white supremacists. And when they use the term white supremacy, they don't mean the Ku Klux Klan. They've sort of redefined that term and they see it as whiteness at large. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep.
It does, and so that ultimately what you have then is you have these oppressor and oppressed groups, and you're trying to make the oppressed the oppressor and the oppressor the oppressed. Like you're constantly, if I got that correct, you're constantly trying to overturn these power structures. Now, I think what's important though is we're juxtaposing this to a biblical perspective, as you've brought up this idea of reconciliation, because I would argue, and we're seeing this in South Africa, that critical theory isn't bringing people together in friendship. It's actually creating a further and further divide. We're seeing that here in North America. Like I said, I never, like, maybe we said this before the podcast. Growing up in Oregon, I did not see any racism in the the school system I went to, in my community. Racism is something, though, that we're hearing on a regular basis these days, and Apologetics Canada is constantly being asked to speak into, which I find shocking. It's just this interesting phenomenon right now where we're seeing this divide is growing, it's not shrinking. And so with what you're talking about here is, reconciliation, it's about friendship, it's about not pushing each other apart, but bringing each other together. Let's just speak about that. What is the work that you're doing, through your ministry, through the church, and how does that look in South Africa, and what are the challenges to actually create real friendships?
So let me just take a step back and say that I am not necessarily on board with people who dismiss all of critical theory or critical race theory, and they say that it is the worst thing to have ever happened and it is demonic and whatever. I am very disillusioned by it, and I can also see a lot of problems. But in as much as it has highlighted certain assumptions, in as much as it has shown that certain fault lines in society, they've done us a favor. It's not the worst thing in the world. So, for example, I mean, some of the stuff that they typically say is that here in South Africa, that most white people can speak Afrikaans and English, which are considered two white languages, although that's unfair because the colored population are also Afrikaans speakers. But you don't speak the black languages. You don't speak Zulu, you don't speak Tswana, Sepedi, whereas the black people can speak Afrikaans and English. So they make that effort, we don't. Now, if somebody puts a little bit of a lens on that and say, okay, then we mock our president who speaks in a very thick black African accent and he butchers some of his English. So we laugh at him. People say, whoa, 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 you can't speak any African language, and you're the guys laughing at this guy speaking he's the 9th or 10th language that this guy has mastered. Now, I mean, that's not the best example, but it's people just putting a little bit of a spotlight there and saying everything is not okay. So, for example, maybe it's the same in North America, but in South Africa, in Afrikaans, this is called menskleur, my color, skin color. Now, that's problematic. There's a huge assumption that this is the color of skin. In Afrikaans, it means this is the color of human. So we call this in Afrikaans human color. This is Troy's brown and black. It's not skin color. Sorry, that doesn't translate that well. We call it human color. Now, I grew up with that, and I didn't grow up in an overtly racist household. But somebody says, maybe that is a little bit problematic, and they're right. So if you look at those things, so let me give you one more example, just to give the critical theorists their due. You guys maybe saw this in South Africa when you were here, but we've got our public transport, people being squashed into taxis. It's also a lot of fun, but they can stand in queues for
a bit of that
for a long time. Now, I have found myself to be more unmoved when I see a 60-year-old black lady standing in that queue and squashing or standing up in the bus because there's no seat or something like that. When I see the same thing and I see a white 60-year-old lady waiting for her turn to get into the taxi for an hour. All of a sudden, it catches my eye. Wow, that doesn't look right. Now, what is the assumption? That it's okay for the one to wait and not the other one? So in as much as the critical theorists helped us to see some of these things that sort of underlying society, I think they helped us. It's not the worst thing, but I think where it became very problematic to talk about things in terms of oppressor and oppressed categories is a dangerous anthropology, because it sees what I mean by anthropology as just it's a dangerous way of looking at humanity, because you are just being reduced to these various identities. You're just being reduced to your whiteness. You're just being reduced to your gender. You're just being reduced to your sexuality. And depending on where you sit on those things determines whether you are in the oppressed and the oppressor category. It's not a very good anthropology. And on top of that, they've got this what we call hermeneutic of suspicion. In other words, you interpret things through a suspicious lens. Because I'm an oppressor on these various things. And remember, I said that I think relationships are so important. I am a big fan of reconciliation, and everything standing on the shoulders of these giants who came before me in South Africa. And but if I come into that conversation, then all of a sudden that is met with suspicion. What is Johan actually saying? Where are the microaggressions in Johan's language? Now I'm thinking, goodness me, guys, in South Africa we've got enough issues. And I'm going to make enough obvious mistakes that you don't have to point out the subtle mistakes that I'm making. You don't have to look for the microaggressions. Just look for my macroaggressions. There are enough things that I'm doing wrong to rather now focus on these little minor things, which doesn't allow for fruitful engagement. I'm ranting a little bit. Forgive me.
No, I actually really, really appreciate you saying that, because I was going to say earlier that one thing we don't want to do then is not be able to appreciate certain aspects that I think it's like looking at critical race theory at its worst, but then also at its best, right? There are some things that need to be identified. There are some things that should have a person asking, at bare minimum, asking the question, having the conversation, right? Because a lot of people don't understand certain social structures. But I mean, we did a whole series called Branded Rethinking Identity, and one of the things that kind of came out of there, as I will speak at different engagements, is I'll tell people, I'm like, I am very proud to be Black, I'm very proud to be Jamaican, but at the end of the day, my heritage and my skin color will fail me every day of the week if I look at my life through that lens. And one of the beautiful things I was afforded, just giving you a brief snapshot of my backstory, is me being adopted from Kingston, Jamaica, raised in a white household, raised in a white community, but then brought up in a church that was primarily indigenous. If you understand Canada a little bit, we have in the United States, they'd be calling them Native Americans. That that group of people. So for us, we would call them Aboriginal or indigenous to the land. And so for me to be growing up in that area, and in that sphere of influence, it afforded me a different snapshot of white culture from the perspective of someone who's not from there, that allowed me to be in spaces with other Black people that would often say, man, all white people want to do is XYZ, all this and that. And I just couldn't engage with it the same way because my family didn't do that, right? Or even in situations where like, you know what a good Black mama's going to do, or you can know what a good Black father's going to do. And I'm sitting back and I'm like, maybe my dad had some in his lineage because my dad operates a lot like that. Or my mom said those similar things. And I would see the looks on my friends' faces like, wait, your mom did that? Okay, well. And there's this term that gets turned around in the Black community, at least in North America, was like, well, your mom could come to a cookout then, right? Meaning her understanding of raising a Black son, or my father being able to understand, I'm going to take my Black son to a Black barber because his hair type is different. These were all things that I was afforded growing up that if you were to blanket critical race theory on one side or the other, you would completely miss these transactions of culture and how relationship, like we're talking about, at its purest form is informative, and
Mm.
it's taking the time to really understand that, okay, there are some things on both sides that we need to be careful of, especially in the church, because I'll speak to people and they'll ask me, hey Troy, what's your opinion on this thing that's going on in the States racially? And being able to understand the traps a little bit affords me to not falling into them, because I know what you're looking for, but because of my upbringing, I'm not actually going to fall into that because my perspective is different.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, is that the problem with apartheid was we spoke about the black danger, spoke about this when the a black majority government is going to be devastating for the white minority, yeah. And it was always the blacks, and it's to a certain extent still the case that we talk like that. But now you've got critical race theory bringing in words like whiteness. South Africa, they talk about white monopoly capital. They keep the capital, white monopoly capital. So they've got these little catchphrases. Now, for me, our jobs as Christians should be to humanize those terms. In other words, you must put a face and a name next to blackness. You must put a face and a name next to whiteness. And we were in a township not long ago. We were running this tutoring program in Tembisa, and I'm waiting there, and we appointed this black lady to run the process. And as she was trying to do it, she did it in a way that was maybe a bit patronizing. Who knows? So the black kids in the township didn't like this black middle class lady and how she was operating, etc. So they address me and they say, Johan, we need to talk to you. We need to talk about Malebo. We're very upset with her. She's very arrogant. She's got a white heart. That's her problem. And I say, whoa, what is a white heart? No. She's arrogant. She speaks down to us. She's got a white heart. I say, do I have a white heart? No. You've got a black heart. And I'm looking at these other guys, big white guys, big Afrikaners. I mean, they look like racists. I say, what about Willem? What about him? No. He also has a black heart. And then I realized that the joy that we have actually is to change those terms, to put faces, to prove to people that we have black hearts as well, and for the black person to prove, and this just happens in proximity and relationship, to prove that he has a white heart, whatever that might mean. I butchered that analogy, but hopefully some of it came through.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me of something you said in your chapter, actually, where you said, Christianity helps me to navigate the complexities of identity issues in a way that doesn't destroy me or others.
That's good.
And the reality is when we dehumanize others, it allows us to destroy. And in fact, that's often the reason we dehumanize, is that then we don't have to see the other and we can treat them however we want. But if we humanize, if we see them, then we're forced to deal with the other in a way that is respectful of their humanity and the dignity that our humanity affords us, which is,
Absolutely.
I would argue, at the heart of what Christianity is seeking to do is that we are seen by God, that God loves us, treats us with a love in a respect that we don't really deserve, but then teaches us to do likewise, that we would see the other and that we would treat them the way that not only that we've been treated, but that we would want to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a reason why Jesus told stories like the Good Samaritan, because the Samaritan wasn't a very good thing back then, but he he reanimates, if that's the correct term. He colors it in. All of a sudden, the Samaritan is the good guy, and I think stories like that we need to live. We need to be the good Afrikaner, the good Zulu. You know what I mean, and that's how you change perceptions.
Yeah.
I think Jesus was inviting us into that story, to be that, in a very racially charged situation, which was the case in first century Palestine, and this is the case today in South Africa.
As we come in for a landing here, how are things going in the work that you're doing with regards to reconciliation? What are some successes and what are some challenges? are facing?
Well, there's enough work. I can tell you that. So it's important that I don't pray for work, because that means that things aren't going that great. But there's enough of it. So you know what I've found is that at the moment, we've been talking about models. Is it this version of capitalism, or is it that version of socialism? Is that going to be the economic model that's going to help South Africa? Or what about this and that thing with regards to how to solve some of our structural issues? But land reform, etc. But what we've been doing for the last few years actually is just collecting and sharing stories. So you're not sharing an ideology, you're not sharing even a strategy, you're just sharing a story. So
Yeah.
we've got stories like people like Kwesi van Sail, this very unassuming Afrikaner farmer there in the Western Cape. And he has managed to help 15 of his farm workers to now farm at a commercial level. So 15 of his farm workers are now commercial farmers. And it happened through friendship, and it is this amazing story. On top of that, they've taken in like 60 orphans on their farm, built this massive orphanage that's really operating well, and it's a beautiful story. There are other farmers who just put all their farms together, and they built a hospice on their farm to take care of the frail and the sick. They built a massive school, and they said this farm from now on is not for profit, it is for this community. So to share stories like that, and not to say that this is what everybody should do, but just to say this is what this guy did, and he felt led to it. Now here's the thing. I've got people, and we do this on a secular stage. So there's no scripture reading and prayer. Nobody has to know anything about my Christianity and whatnot. I just ask these people in these little short TED-style talks to come and share their story. And almost without exception, it is a Jesus story. It has been some of the most evangelistically potent events that I've ever been a part of. Because if you do an apologetics conference and you want to talk about the cosmological argument and the evidence for the resurrection, chances are the skeptic is not going to come. But if you're going to share stories of successes in land reform, successes of trying to renew some of our towns, municipalities, etc., successes of white and black people coming together, friendships within different sectors, people are interested because we need those stories. And more often than not, almost without exception, I should say, they are very much motivated by people's deep commitment to following Jesus. And it's evangelistically so potent. Now, that's definitely not the sum of what we do. We, as a NGO, we fix potholes together. Now, usually when other NGOs fix potholes, I'm not sure if you guys even know the term, but the holes in the road. And
Yep.
I would say the reason why we have to do that, because we want to address our infrastructure, but also we do that black and white together. And that just disarms the whole thing. So not this thing of, the whites are now fixing the failing black government's infrastructure. No. We're not going to do that. We're going to do this together. So we've got all sorts of tricks like that, trying to connect commercial farmers with up-and-coming emerging farmers, trying to take those things that are very, very polarizing, like holes in the roads and agriculture, and to say, let's very intentionally get black and white people together to see if we can find stories of success. And I think that we have. It's on a micro level, but I don't think our solution in South Africa is going to be on a macro level. It's not going to be a negotiated thing. It's going to come from the ground up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and just really spending your time with us today. I think it's, when you start talking about critical race theory, it's very, very helpful to also have something that add context, right? And to have something that you can, really point to and look at in real time. So something like what's going on in South Africa. But I'm sure there's going to be people that want to connect with you and want to, potentially follow any of the work that you're doing. If people wanted to do that, what would be kind of the best way of going about that?
Well, it depends whether I'm still invited to speak at your conference in Canada. So that would be the one. But no, they're more than welcome. I think if you Google Beter Einders, Better Enders, but you can maybe just put a link somewhere in the description, .co.za. Then that would be a landing page. It's not the best website, but from there on, you can get onto some of our social channels and see of some of the things that we are doing. And yeah, if you're on there, then you're going to connect with me.
Well, Yuan, thank you so much for joining us today on the AC podcast. It was an honor to have you, and just your insights and also the work that you're doing. I know for us as an organization, we will be praying for you in that work. And yeah, we're looking forward to the prospect of you being able to come to this side, to come to the conference and get to hang out with you, and maybe introduce you some Canadian cuisine or whatever we got to do on this side of things. But thank you so much for joining us. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning into the AC podcast. This is a ministry of Apologetics Canada, so if you would like to support us in any capacity, you can always reach out to us at info@apologeticscanada.com or head to our website at apologeticscanada.com. But you know the drill, you know the motto. Till next time, love God, love people. Bye for now.
It's the AC Podcast.